Today, we are diving deep into one of the most important, one of the most powerful autobiographies in American history, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And let me tell you, this is so much more than just a historical document. It is a raw, unflinching, first-hand account of a human soul being forged in absolute fire. It's a story about a journey from the deepest, darkest depths of bondage to the very pinnacle of freedom and influence. Right from the jump, Douglass pulls no punches. He throws this incredibly visceral, unforgettable image at us, the blood-stained gate. Just think about that for a second. He's making it crystal clear that this isn't some story told from a safe, comfortable distance. No, this is a journey that begins at a gate literally stained with blood, and he's about to pull us right through it with him, straight into the inferno. All right, so here's the path we're going to follow on this journey. We'll start as heated at that blood-stained gate and really unpack the system of dehumanization. Then we'll listen for the songs of sorrow that first sparked his consciousness. From there, we'll witness the incredible moment his manhood was resurrected, track his dangerous flight to freedom, and finally, see how he became one of the most powerful voices against slavery the world has ever known. Let's get into it.
Okay, to truly understand Frederick Douglass, you have to start right here. You have to understand that slavery wasn't just about forced labor. It was a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient system designed to strip a person of their humanity, right from the very moment they took their first breath.
Just look at this stark contrast. This is absolutely brutal, and it's by design. This isn't just random cruelty. It's a very specific strategy of total erasure. Think about it. Not knowing your own age, your own birthday, being treated like livestock, being ripped away from your mother so you can't form that fundamental human bond, having no bed, barely any clothes, being fed from a trough like an animal. Each and every one of these acts is like a precise, deliberate cut, meant to sever the ties that make us human. It's a system built to deny you a past, a family, a name, any sense of self-worth at all.
And that was the entire point. Dehumanization wasn't just some unfortunate byproduct of slavery. No, it was the very engine that powered the whole horrific machine. By systematically robbing people of their identity, of their humanity, the institution could then justify its own unimaginable cruelty. It was the only way it could maintain its absolute, brutal control. For a young Frederick Douglass, this abstract horror became terrifyingly, personally real with the whipping of his Aunt Hester. This wasn't something he just heard about. It was his personal initiation. Can you imagine being a child, woken up by the sounds of those shrieks, the sight of his own aunt's blood? That was the blood-stained gate he wrote about. This one singular traumatic event seared the full nightmarish reality of his world into his mind forever. Now, the agents of this brutality were the overseers, and Douglass describes one man in particular, a Mr. Gore, who was the perfect embodiment of the system's cold, twisted logic. His cruelty wasn't wild or out of control. It was precise. It was calculated. It was part of a philosophy built on one thing and one thing only: absolute power. This line right here is absolutely chilling. It just lays the system's entire philosophy bare. What it's saying is that the appearance of an overseer's authority was more important than the truth. It was more important than justice, and it was certainly more important than the life of a Black person. To even question the overseer was to question the entire foundation of slavery itself, and that could never, ever be tolerated. And right here, we see that maxim put into its most brutal action. The story of Demby is just horrifying. An enslaved man named Demby, trying to escape a whipping, runs into a creek to soothe his wounds. Mr. Gore tells him to come out. Demby refuses, so Gore, without hesitation, raises his musket and shoots him dead, right there in the water. And his justification? That Demby was setting a dangerous example. The system's response to this cold-blooded murder? It was deemed satisfactory. No trial, no investigation, no consequences. A human life was just extinguished, simply to make a point and maintain control. Now, you have to wonder, how does anyone survive this? Well, amidst this soul-crushing brutality, something began to shift inside Douglass. The very first sparks of his own consciousness, his own intellectual resistance, were ignited not by a book, not by a speech, but by sound. They were ignited when he finally began to understand the true, hidden meaning of the songs his fellow enslaved people sang in the fields. And the difference between what outsiders heard and what he understood is just profound. To a slaveholder or anyone who wanted to believe the lie, these songs might have just sounded like happy, contented workers. But Douglass, he says he was within the circle.
He knew the truth. These weren't songs of happiness at all. They were coded messages of an unbearable sadness, a tale of woe wrapped in a melody. They were a secret prayer to God for a deliverance they didn't dare speak of out loud.
I mean, Douglas's own words just capture it so perfectly. Singing wasn't a sign of joy, it was a release valve. It was catharsis. It was the only way to let out a pain so deep that it had no other way to escape. It was, as he says, the sound of an aching heart being relieved by its own tears. And for Douglas, finally understanding this was a huge step towards seeing the true, soul-killing nature of slavery.
This brings us to what is maybe the most important turning point in the entire narrative. Douglas gets sent to a man named Edward Covey, a farmer who had a special reputation as a slave breaker. His entire job, his specialty, was to take enslaved people who showed any sign of a rebellious spirit and utterly crush them. And after months of being broken down physically and spiritually, Douglas finally reached his absolute limit.
So let's be clear, what happened next wasn't just a fistfight. It was a conscious, deliberate process of reclaiming his soul. After months of abuse that had nearly extinguished the fire inside him, Douglas reached a point where he decided he would rather die on his feet than live on his knees. The 2-hour physical battle that followed wasn't just a fight against Covey, it was a fight for his very identity. It was a battle for his manhood. And it ended with the rebirth of his spirit. And this, right here, is the most crucial part. Yeah, Covey never laid a hand on him again, but the physical victory was almost secondary. The real triumph, the real victory, was internal. In that moment of resistance, Douglas writes that he killed the slave within his own mind. He revived his sense of self-worth. He was still legally a slave, yes, but in his mind, in his spirit, he was free. And from that day forward, his physical escape was no longer just a dream. It became an absolute inevitability. So, having won his inner freedom, Douglas now set his sights on breaking his external chains. This next part of the story is all about his daring, brilliantly planned escape from the slave state of Maryland all the way to the north. This map lays out the journey, and you have to understand, this wasn't one single desperate dash. It was a calculated, nerve-wracking, multi-stage trip deep through enemy territory. Every single stop you see here, every time he had to get off a train and onto a steamer, was a moment of unbelievable risk. If he was discovered, it meant being dragged back to a fate far, far worse than anything he had ever endured before. The stakes could not have been higher. And he didn't do it alone. This escape was a testament not only to his own incredible courage, but also to the power of a community and a network. The journey was funded by Anna Murray, a free Black woman who he would later marry. It required a clever disguise and forged seaman's papers, and even when he finally reached the North, he was still a fugitive. He had to rely on the abolitionist Underground Railroad, on people like David Ruggles in New York, to stay safe. Freedom was seized through both incredible individual will and coordinated collective action. But here's the thing about Frederick Douglass. He didn't just escape to freedom and settle into a quiet life. He couldn't. He understood that his own liberty was fragile, that it was incomplete as long as millions of others remained in chains. So he quickly transformed himself from a fugitive running from slavery into one of the most powerful weapons the abolitionist movement had ever seen. The impact was immediate, and it's almost impossible to overstate. Over 1 million people read his story. 1 million. By simply telling the truth of his life, he exposed the raw, undeniable brutality of slavery to a world that had, for the most part, tried its best to look away. His eloquence, his intelligence, his first-hand experience, it was a combination that couldn't be denied. His book wasn't just a book. It was a weapon. It was an indictment that galvanized the abolitionist cause like never before. And just look at this timeline. Look how quickly he ascended. It's incredible. Within just a few years of escaping bondage, he's a celebrated public speaker. He publishes his world-changing autobiography. He founds his own influential newspaper, the North Star. And he even attends the very first women's rights convention, showing everyone that for him, the fight for freedom and equality was universal. He didn't just ask for a seat at the table. He went out and built his own. When you look back, Douglass's entire life is a testament to the power of a single educated voice. The slaveholders, they understood this perfectly. That's exactly why they made it illegal for enslaved people to learn how to read. They knew that knowledge was the pathway to freedom. And once Douglass unlocked that pathway for himself, he found his voice. And with that voice, he not only liberated himself, but he helped liberate an entire nation. Which really leaves us with this final thought. Once a person or a people truly finds their voice, can it ever really be silenced again?